Dr. James Strickler, and this lecture will cover Chapter 6, titled A New Nation, in the United States History textbook, American Yawp. The first topic that we'll discuss in this chapter we can call a more perfect union. This will cover the founding of the United States of America following the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, the 13 former colonies, which by their act of war had turned themselves into 13 separate little countries, tried to find a way to continue to cooperate together for their benefit, as they had done during the Revolution itself. To try to accomplish this, they entered into a treaty with each other called the Articles of Confederation, which lasted for nearly a decade. A lot of people don't understand this about American history, that we did not go straight from the colonies winning the Revolution to the establishment of the United States of America under the United States Constitution. Instead, we had this window of time in between, when we had 13 separate little countries trying to work together as a confederation. But that effort to work together was problematic in a bunch of ways. First of all, the 13 separate little countries had ran up a common debt during the Revolution, and they were unable, under the Confederation government, to pay off that debt. Remember from previous chapters that during the American Revolution, the 13 colonies cooperated together through the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress established an army led by George Washington. Well, they had to have money for that army. They had to have money for supplies, those sorts of things. And they borrowed the money. They borrowed it from people, not banks. And those people then wanted their money paid off. Well, that debt was owed by the Continental Congress. And when the Articles of Confederation were established, they were then passed on, that debt was then passed on to the Confederation government. But the problem was the Confederation had no power to lay taxes, to collect any money to pay off that debt. They had to actually ask the states for money to do this, and the states were unwilling to give them money. The states had their own problems that they had to deal with, their own debts that they had to pay off, and they were not going to give money to the Confederation. This meant that the people who had loaned money to finance the war effort were not getting paid off. And since they weren't getting paid off, then they couldn't spend the money on anything. And that meant that the entire economy was suffering as a result. A related problem under the Articles of Confederation, which also affected the economy, was these 13 separate little countries each had 13 separate little kinds of money. And the Confederation government also issued its own kind of money. So you had 14 kinds of money in circulation. So if you, for example, raised tobacco in Georgia and then you wanted to take it up and sell it in Massachusetts, you would have to be willing to get paid in Massachusetts dollars. But you can't spend those Massachusetts dollars in Georgia. So this made trade difficult between these 13 new states, which again harmed the economy. A third problem was they put up trade barriers against each other. These 13 new little countries, these 13 states, were desperate for money. And one of the ways that governments got money primarily back then was by taxing things coming into their state as trade. So again, if you were a farmer here in Georgia that raised tobacco and you tried to take it up to Massachusetts to sell it, not only would you have to be willing to accept Massachusetts dollars in payment, but you would also have to pay the state of Massachusetts for the privilege of selling your tobacco there. Well, if you're going to have to pay in order to sell your tobacco there, you're going to be reluctant to take your tobacco there, which means you're going to be less likely to do trade with each other. And that also is going to harm the economy. So in the aftermath of the American Revolution, all these 13 separate new countries were in a state of economic recession. Things were not going well. Then on top of that, you had an event happen in Massachusetts called SHAYS Rebellion, which showed just how much trouble these states were in by themselves. SHAYS Rebellion is named after a man named Daniel SHAYS. He was a veteran of the American Revolution, and the problem that ended up taking his name, Shays Rebellion, concerned the collection of debts from farmers in Massachusetts. Okay, so now remember, the economy is not going well. So the farmers are not making money, but they have two problems. The state of Massachusetts is trying to collect taxes from them, and at the same time, the banks that they got loans from to buy their farms or to buy their seeds to plant or whatever it may be, they're wanting to collect their debts. But the farmers are not making money because the economy is bad. They have no money to pay the banks. They have no money to pay the tax collector. Well, what happens is the bank or the tax collector then goes to court and they confiscate the farmer's farm in payment of the debt. So the farmers in western Massachusetts were in danger of losing their farms because the economy was not good and they were heavily in debt. Well, what happened was Daniel Shays organized some of these farmers, and this rebellion spread against the collectors from the bank and from the government for taxes. What they would do is if a tax collector showed up in town or someone from a bank came to collect money on a mortgage, they would round these people up and just throw them in jail as a way to keep them away so that the people could keep their farms. Well, once news of this rebellion against the tax collectors and the bankers reached the government in Boston, the government of the state of Massachusetts decided that they couldn't allow this to go on. They had to bring law and order back to this area of western Massachusetts that was in rebellion. So they organized troops, and those troops were sent to western Massachusetts to stop this farmer rebellion. Well, at least initially, when the troops got there, they were confronted by citizen militias, like back at the time of the American Revolution. Local people, farmers, got their guns, and they went out and they faced up against the troops. And at least initially, they won. They defeated the army of the state of Massachusetts. Now, this got reported in newspapers in all the other states, and this scared everyone to death. And here's why. Think about it. If a few disorganized farmers can go and grab their muskets and go to battle against the army of the state of Massachusetts and defeat it, then what happens if Britain comes back and invades Massachusetts? The British army would easily defeat the Massachusetts army. This showed the people in these new states just how weak they were alone. They were only able to defeat the British because they cooperated together. But now they are struggling under the Articles of Confederation to cooperate. This makes them all vulnerable to invasion from Britain or from Spain or from France or from whoever. So these 13 states realize that they need to find a better way to cooperate. And this leads eventually to the calling of a convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Delegates are sent from all the states to attend this convention with the express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. In other words, making changes to them in ways that will allow these 13 separate countries to cooperate together better for the good of them all. The delegates that come to this convention, though, face a delicate balancing act. Okay, they understand that the Articles of Confederation are too weak. They can't deal with the problems they're facing. The problems of trade, the problems of currency, the problems of debt, the problems of rebellion like Shays Rebellion. But at the same time, they want to protect the independence of the states. In other words, allow each state to deal with these problems the way they want. They don't want a strong central government that forces the states to do what that central government wants. That's the thing that they fought a revolution against. But they also know that they need a stronger central government for them to cooperate together. They're going to try to find the balance of creating a government that's strong enough to deal with the problems, but not too strong. Well, as they consider this problem and begin to work through it at the convention, they quickly come to realize that the Articles of Confederation are unworkable, that they really need to start from scratch. And so what they do is they agree to amend the Articles of Confederation out of existence. In essence, the change that they're going to make is to delete the entire document and replace it with a brand new document. Some new document that will bind these 13 separate countries together in some new way. Well, once they had made that decision, what they're going to do, no one really knew what to do. Let me rephrase that so I'm clear. Once they made the decision they had to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and replace it with something new, no one knew what that new thing would be, except James Madison. You see, James Madison was a delegate from Virginia, and he had figured this out on his own long before. Long before he showed up at the convention, he had realized that the Articles of Confederation were unworkable, that they would need to delete them completely and replace them with something else. And so he came up with a plan. That plan became known as the Virginia Plan because he was a delegate from Virginia. Well, if you ever have a chance in your life to attend some sort of meeting and nobody at the meeting knows what they should be doing there, except one person has a plan of what they should do, guess what the meeting's going to do? They're going to follow the one person that has a plan. Well, that's what happened here. James Madison had a plan, and that plan ended up becoming the outline for a new government that they created. The Philadelphia Convention then, following Madison's plan, drafted what became known as the Constitution of the United States of America. And this was a radical thing for them to do. The most radical part about it is what it did to the states themselves. Once they agreed to this new Constitution, these 13 independent states, 13 separate little countries, would bind themselves together as a single country, the United States of America. Now, they still wanted to achieve the balance I talked about before. They didn't want to give all the power to this new government that they are creating, or the United States of America. They wanted to keep a bunch of the power in the states, but it was going to give a lot more power to this new government, this new country, than had existed under the Confederation. It was still going to leave a lot of power to the states, but it was going to make them one country together with one central government over them. Now, once they had decided this radical move of taking these 13 separate countries and making them into one country, then you had to figure out what the government was going to be like that would rule over them. They fairly quickly agreed to this idea that we now call separation of powers. The notion that you would take different functions of the government and put them in different branches. So you would have the legislative branch that would make laws for the country. We now call that the Congress today. You would have the executive branch, which would carry out the laws for the country. We now call that the presidency. And it would have the judicial branch, which would judge whether or not people are obeying the laws of the country. That is the United States Supreme Court. Well, having decided that they were going to be these three branches, they still have to figure out exactly what the three branches are going to be responsible for. And they also had to figure out exactly how we would decide who is in each of these branches. So, as they thought about the legislative branch, the branch that would make the laws for the country, a debate took place between the delegates from the states with big populations and the delegates from the states with small populations. The high population states wanted the Congress, this legislative branch, based on population. In other words, if your state has more people, you get more representatives in the government. The delegates from the small states said, no, every state should be represented equally. And their argument was, we've come to this meeting as equal separate little countries. New Jersey is just as equal in this meeting as Virginia, for example. Why would we give that up? Why would we let a high population state like Virginia get more power in the new government and New Jersey have less? So they said every state should be represented equally in the new government. Now, in saying this, something that's important to understand is that they were trying to figure out how representation would take place. In other words, how the people in these states would choose other people, a small number of people, to actually meet in the government and decide the laws for them. America, this United States of America they're creating, was not a democracy. It is not a democracy today. It has never been a democracy. That's a word that is frequently misused by people. Democracy means that the people themselves are the government. It would mean that in America today, the 300 million people that make up the United States of America would all be government officials. We would all have a say in what the government does. That's not how our governmental system works. Instead, we elect representatives to make laws for us. Now, this is an important distinction, because if you ask the founding fathers, the people that were actually in this meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, are you creating a democracy? They would say, well, no way, we're not. Are you crazy? Democracies are insane. They never work, and here's why. They thought if you put too much power in the hands of the people, then what you end up having is what they would call mob rule. And what we mean by this is the loudest, angriest people end up ruling the government. They're the ones that get what they want, which is usually something really kind of stupid. And things become a giant mess. And what inevitably happens when you have that system is once it's become a giant mess, then somebody comes riding in on a white horse, so to speak, and says, I will save the day for you. Your democracy has become nothing but an unworkable, vicious mob. Give me power and I'll fix it for you. This is the demagogue, the savior that comes in to fix everything. And inevitably what has happened historically is these demagogues then end up using power that's given to them by the people to fix everything, to make themselves kings and emperors, absolute rulers, dictators. So this has happened in history many times, and the founding fathers knew that this is the kind of thing that happened. So they were not going to give power directly to the hands of the people. They wanted to create a representative government, but the question was, how would the representatives be chosen? Well, this was one of the major compromises that took place in the Constitutional Convention. There are three that we're going to talk about. The first one is oftentimes called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, because the person who came up with the solution was a delegate from Connecticut. This is the compromise that dealt with this issue about representation. Would the United States Congress have representatives chosen based on population, with big states getting more, or would every state have an equal voice in it? The solution to this disagreement between the states with high populations and the states with low populations was presented by a delegate from Connecticut, as I said, a man named Roger Sherman. And his solution was actually quite simple. Let's do both. Well, how do you do both? You set up a government with a bicameral legislature. What bicameral means is that the government will have two houses in it. You won't just have one legislature. Instead, it'll be split into two pieces. One we will call the House of Representatives, and it will be divided up, or in other words, apportioned based on population. So states with more people get more seats in the House of Representatives. The other part will be the United States Senate, where every state gets equal representation. In our system, that's 2 senators. So the state with the smallest population at the time that the Constitution was written, I think that was Delaware, got 2 representatives, and the state with the highest population also got 2 senators, sorry, I said representatives a moment ago, got 2 senators in the United States Senate. So every state gets 2 senators in the Senate, but in the House of Representatives, Virginia would get a lot more representatives than Delaware. This was the compromise solution, and for any law to pass, it has to make it through both of these houses. This was a way to both honor the idea of government representing the people in the House of Representatives and these 13 separate little countries being treated equally when they join together in the Senate. The second major compromise from the Constitutional Convention is called the 3/5 Compromise. This also dealt with representation, but particularly how you would count population for deciding how many representatives a state would have. The southern states wanted to be able to count their slaves. It's very simple as far as they were concerned. This is a counting of people. The slaves are people, so we count them too. But what this really meant was by counting their slaves, they would have a higher population, they would get more representatives. The northern states did not like this idea. They looked at the southern states and said, well, wait a minute, you don't even treat your slaves actually as people. So what makes you think you would get to count them to give you more power? Really, that makes no sense that these people that you're abusing and treating as property are going to be a benefit for you to get more governmental power. No way. We're not going to let you count your slaves. Well, again, there had to be some sort of compromise. If there wasn't, then the states would never have agreed. There would have been no Constitution. There would have been no United States of America. So the agreement they came up with was to count every person who was not a free person. That's the kind of way that they worded it, because they never actually mentioned slavery anywhere in the Constitution. They would count every person who was not a free person in this way. For every 5 of those non-free people, 3 of them would be counted as part of the population. So in other words, 3/5 of the slaves would be counted and 2/5 would not. Sometimes people ask, how did they come up with that number 3/5? It was a negotiation. One side wanted every slave counted. The other side said none will be counted. Somebody suggested, well, how about we count half of them? The other side said, no, how about 3/4? Eventually they settled on 3/5. It was a compromise. Now, this compromise, from our modern point of view, we may see it as despicable. How dare you acknowledge slavery in this way in the Constitution and even give the southern states some benefit for having slaves? But this was the price that had to be paid in order for the southern states to agree. Without this, there would have never been a United States of America. The third major compromise of the Constitutional Convention also concerned slavery, but it was particular about the importation of slaves from Africa. There was a thriving trade, as we've talked about in previous chapters, of people bringing slaves from Africa, bringing people from Africa to become slaves in America. Remember, we've talked about this before, that it was a common practice among the tribes in Africa that when they went to war with each other, to take each other's prisoners as slaves, and then to exchange those with Europeans at the coast for durable goods like pots and pans and things like that. And then the slaves were brought to America to work as agricultural workers to produce the goods that would then go to the mother countries to keep this system of mercantilism going that we've discussed before. Well, this becomes in danger as a practice because of something that had already been previously decided at the Constitutional Convention. See, remember, one of the problems that they had come to the Constitutional Convention to address was that the states were not freely trading with each other. They were putting taxes on each other's goods coming in. I gave the example of if you raise tobacco in Georgia and then you try to sell it in Massachusetts, you get stopped and you have to pay Massachusetts taxes first. Well, the way they decided the convention to settle that problem was that they would no longer allow the states themselves to regulate commerce, in other words, trade amongst themselves or with foreign countries. Instead, this new central government, this government of the United States that they were creating, would set rules for commerce, in other words, trade between states or with other countries. Now think about this. If you let Congress set the rules for trade, one of the things Congress could potentially do is say, all right, no more slaves coming in from Africa. And this is something the southern states worried about. And so another compromise was reached. The compromise was that while Congress can potentially ban the slave trade with Africa, they have to wait until the year 1808. In other words, 20 years after the Constitution would go into effect. So they could ban the slave trade eventually, but they had to wait 20 years to do it. Why 20 years? Because the slaveholding South thought this would give them time to import enough slaves from Africa to create a self-sustaining population of slaves here in America. And that's exactly what they did. And the way history would play out is 20 years later, Congress would ban the slave trade with Africa. In addition to the Constitutional Convention figuring out these compromises and setting up the Congress, they also had to figure out what the presidency would be like, the executive branch. And one of the things they settled on was a concept that now today we call the unitary executive. Now, what this simply means is that there is one chief executive for the country. Una means one. So the unitary executive is the executive. He's the one that tells everybody else what to do. Now, remember when I talked about the three branches of government a few moments ago? I talked about that the legislative branch, the Congress, makes the law, and then the executive branch, the presidency, carries it out. The president actually now in America today has millions of people that work for him, but still it's his job to carry out the laws, and they are his employees to help him accomplish that. You can see this in the Constitution, where it says that the executive power shall be invested in a president, not in multiple presidents, not in a president and a vice president and a secretary of state and a secretary of commerce and a secretary of defense. No, all those other people work for the president. He's the boss. The buck stops with him. Now, it then becomes a question, if we have this very powerful man, the one person responsible for executing the laws of the United States of America, how are we going to choose this person? This became another important compromise of the convention. The reason it was an important compromise is that not that the overall objective was in dispute, but the exact method of accomplishing it was not obvious. The overall objective was to insulate the president from the mob. Remember a few moments ago I talked about how they were scared to death of the idea of democracy. They didn't really want to leave the people in charge because the people were generally ignorant. The people were generally more passionate and superstitious. They could be easily riled up to do dumb things. And so they worried about letting the people choose the president, that they might choose very badly. And so they decided to insulate the process of choosing the president by, instead of having voters vote for the president, which is a more recent development in American history, what they decided to do was to have the states appoint people who they thought would be sort of the wise old men of the country to pick a president for us. And those people who would pick the president for us, they called electors. And those electors collectively together would be known as the Electoral College. You may still recall this from the 2020 presidential election when President Biden defeated President Trump in the Electoral College. That's what really mattered. Whoever gets the most electoral votes in the Electoral College from these electors. So this is how the system was originally designed to run. This slide has some very specific sorts of dates on it. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to ask you anything about that on an exam. But get to know the flow of how things happen here. What happens to begin with is you have voters in a state who select their state government, the state legislature, the people who make laws for that state. And then what the Constitution does is it assigns the legislature the responsibility of choosing electors. They can pick anybody they want, any way they want. And then those electors get together in the Electoral College to choose the president for us. So one of the things that people oftentimes wonder once they learn that this is how the system actually works in the Constitution is, why do we even hold a presidential election then? The reason is because the way things have evolved, state legislatures base their decisions of who they're going to choose as electors based on who wins the popular vote in their state. So, for example, to refer to the 2020 presidential election again, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by about 8,000 votes. As a result of that, the state legislature of Georgia appointed electors who were going to support Joe Biden to then participate in the Electoral College to select him as President of the United States. So they solved a lot of major problems, major differences of opinion through these various compromises at the Constitutional Convention. But just because the delegates of the convention managed to agree on what the Constitution should contain, that doesn't mean that the whole country was going to agree to it. Now remember, they were just sent there to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Those amendments would need to be approved, or in other words, ratified by the states themselves. Remember, they are independent countries still. They don't have to go along with any of this if they don't want to. So in the Constitution itself, it says that once the Constitution is sent out to the states to be ratified, that as soon as 9 states approve it, it will then go into effect. At that point, then, you have a United States of America with 9 states making up this new big country. At that point, the other 4 that hadn't agreed to it yet would still be their own independent little countries out there, but eventually they would all agree. Now, this wasn't a done deal from the beginning, though. It was not a sure thing that any of the states would approve this new Constitution. And as it went out to be approved by the states, people fell into one of 2 camps. On one side were the Federalists, people who supported the idea of this new Constitution, who thought it was a great idea. On the other side were those who opposed it, who became known as anti-Federalists. Now, they never liked that name, but they were kind of stuck with it because the Federalists grabbed the name Federalist first, and the people who opposed them ended up being called anti. But nonetheless, whether they liked the name or not, these are the 2 camps. Well, why would the anti-Federalists oppose the Constitution? Well, generally speaking, the big reason is because they liked their states the way they were. They liked being independent. They were fearful of the idea of creating some new government in Washington, D.C. that could boss Georgia around, for example, and tell Georgia what to do. This scared them. It particularly scared them because some people, like Patrick Henry here, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, who was a member of the government in Virginia, thought that this new Constitution that was being proposed and the new government that was being created on it had a basic essential flaw. And that was it would not leave the people with the means to defend their rights, their freedoms, their liberties against any future tyrant, any future dictator that might come along. This was a common complaint among the anti-federalists, and they were not going to go along with this new Constitution unless some mechanism were provided to make sure that we would maintain those rights that would allow us to stand up against some future dictator. Well, this led the anti-federalists to demand that a Bill of Rights be attached to the Constitution. A Bill of Rights is a list of things that the government is not allowed to do. So some examples of that would be what we eventually had in the First Amendment, that we have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, things like that. And what that really means is the government can't take your freedom of speech away from you. The government can't take your freedom of religion away from you. Another example would be the Second Amendment, which says we have the right to bear arms, which means the government can't come and confiscate our guns. Now, why would they want these kind of protections in there? So that in the First Amendment, if we end up with a tyrannical government, we can stand up and accuse them of being a tyrannical government without being thrown in jail. That's freedom of speech. And the Second Amendment, so we have guns to go shoot them if that's what needs to be done to get rid of that bad government. Now, that may seem like kind of a crazy thing to think about today, but remember, the people that wrote these documents had lived through that. These were people who fought in the American Revolution. They had actually went home and got their guns to go out and shoot the soldiers that were oppressing them. And they knew that that's something that could possibly be a necessity at some time in the future. So that's the kind of things they wanted in the Bill of Rights. Well, when the Anti-Federalists proposed this Bill of Rights, the Federalists, at least initially, opposed it. And they had a very logical reason why. They said, whoa, 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 whoa. It reverses the assumption of enumerated powers. Now, it may not be obvious to begin with what exactly that actually means. So let me explain it. In the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, it lists out all the things that the government is allowed to make laws about. Things like Congress can collect taxes, Congress can coin money, Congress can set up an army and a navy, things like that. Well, there's this assumption in how the Constitution is written that if it tells us what the government can make laws about, then anything that isn't on that list, they can't do. That's how the Constitution was written. Unless the government's told they can do something, they can't do it. But if you then add a Bill of Rights listing what the government can't do, at that point the government may say, well, you know what, if the Bill of Rights doesn't say we can't, we're going to assume we can. So it may in fact actually grow the power of the government by having a Bill of Rights. Well, that's a pretty good argument, but it wasn't persuasive enough for the anti-federalists. They still feared that if we create this government, even if it has these enumerated, these listed powers, it will try to go beyond them. We just know it will. And the only way we're going to stop it is if we have this Bill of Rights to protect us. So eventually, the Federalists agreed, all right, fine. If you just go along with the Constitution, we will add a Bill of Rights to it. But that in and of itself wasn't still enough to persuade people. It was touch and go for a while. Even after we got the ninth state to approve, there were still some big states out there that hadn't approved, New York in particular. And if New York had never decided to join this new country, the new country might have ended up falling apart. So what happened was three very influential Federalists wrote a series of letters to newspapers in New York trying to encourage people to support the idea of this new constitution so it would be approved by New York and New York would join this new union. And their collected letters that they wrote to newspapers have become known collectively as the Federalist Papers, as they made the Federalist argument for why we should have this Constitution. Well, two Federalist Papers in particular are fairly well known today by people who at least have an initial course in how the government of the United States was created. One of those is Federalist 10, the 10th letter written by these three men to the newspapers in New York. In particular, it was written by James Madison, that guy that we call the father of the Constitution, the guy that showed up at the Constitutional Convention with the Virginia Plan. And one of the concerns that people had about this new Constitution was that, wait a minute, in the past, what's always happened is that if you have a country, some group in it tries to capture the government to do what they want for their little group. And the way in the past to avoid that was to have a really little country where basically everybody's the same. So it doesn't really matter who gets control of the government. Whoever they are, they'll want the same thing as everybody else. But that could not be a solution to this problem, which they called the problem of factions, because this new United States that they were forming was going to be a very big country with lots of different people in it. And this led people to be concerned. Hey, will we people in Georgia have some other groups from New York and Massachusetts, wherever, capture the government and have it do stuff we don't like and oppress us? So Madison had to deal with this concern to alleviate it so people would support the Constitution. And in Federalist 10, what he argues is you're better off having a large republic rather than a small one to deal with this problem of faction. And here's why. In a large republic, you're going to have lots of different kinds of people. No one group is ever going to be big enough then to get control of the government. They're going to be forced to cooperate with each other, to compromise with each other, and that will be a better thing. The other Federalist paper that is most well known was also written by James Madison. It is Federalist 51, and it dealt with a different concern. The concern was, well, you've created these different branches of government. What's to stop them from just gobbling up more power than they're supposed to have and using that power to oppress the states? What James Madison argued in Federalist 51 is that the people who filled the jobs in these branches of government, whether it be judges on the Supreme Court or the President of the United States or members of Congress, they would all love power themselves. They would be ambitious, is the term used here in this quote. They would want more and better stuff for themselves. And this would cause them to fight amongst each other. And this, he argued, would keep each other in check. If Congress tried to gobble up more power than it was supposed to have, the president and the Supreme Court would push back against them. If the president tried to gobble up too much power, then the Congress and the court would push back against him. And the reason they would push back is because they want the power for themselves. So they'd always be fighting over the power, and in this way they would keep each other under control, or in other words, in check. And this is where the term checks and balances comes from that you may have heard before. So people like Madison and Hamilton and Jay are making arguments like this in newspapers, like the articles collected as the Federalist Papers, and slowly they're persuading the states to agree. And as more and more states agree, then it gains its own momentum. Here in this political cartoon from the time period, it shows Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire having agreed to this. And then it shows Virginia, which had been toppled over, being pulled up to become the next state. And if it does that, it's going to pull New York up with it. Why? Because think about it. If you have this big new country forming around you, do you want to be the one little country that's left out? No, because if you are, what's going to eventually happen is you're going to end up in conflict with this big new country. It's going to be too big and powerful for you, and it will end up invading you and taking you over. So instead of waiting around for that to happen, you might as well join now as an equal. And that's eventually what happened. Here in this slide, you can see the dates by which all of the 13 original colonies ended up becoming the 13 original states of the United States of America. Didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly over time, one state after another. But eventually, we got 11 states in time for the first presidential election. Now remember, as soon as New Hampshire joined and we had 9 states, then at that point the Constitution went into effect. We could elect a Congress, we could elect a president, things like that. But before that could happen, you had 2 more states that joined, Virginia and New York. And then in the time afterwards, after that first presidential election, you had 2 more states join, North Carolina and eventually Rhode Island. You can see that it's a couple years, more than a couple years from the time Delaware joins till Rhode Island finally joins. But they did, for the reasons I said before. You don't want to be the one little state left out that will just be taken over later on. Well, as the states were deciding whether or not they would approve this Constitution, they had their own debates and their own conventions. And in those conventions, they oftentimes suggested amendments that they wanted to see be made to the Constitution to make it more agreeable to them. These amendments were eventually collected and condensed down, and they would become what we call the Bill of Rights today. But different states suggested different things. But there was one suggestion that every state had in common, and that was seen, for example, in this suggestion from the state of Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts wanted added to the Constitution a statement that would say very clearly that any powers not given to this new government of the United States of America that was being created would instead remain with the states. In other words, think about this. Going into the Constitutional Convention, the states, each of them themselves, has entire power over themselves. Nobody tells people in Georgia what to do but the people of Georgia. Well, if they're going to give up some of that power to this new national government, they want to make sure they don't give up all the power. So they want to put explicitly in the Constitution, any powers not given to the national government remain with the states. Well, as they made these suggestions, like I said, they were eventually condensed down together. The Bill of Rights was written. It was sent out to the states to be ratified by them, and eventually it was approved in 1791. This Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And that suggestion that I showed you, that suggestion that every state had, that whatever powers are not given to the national government need to be clearly stated as remaining with the states, ends up showing up as the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And you can see it here. Any powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states or to the people. So now, having established a government of the United States of America, we have to see what it actually does with the powers that it has been given. And the first area to examine that is the area of domestic power. In other words, power within the United States of America itself. And there was a debate among the people in the beginning, after the government was first established, about how much power it really had. This was seen in an argument between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton was appointed by George Washington, the first president of the United States, to be the Secretary of the Treasury, the man in charge of the nation's money, while Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, the man involved in our dealings with other countries. And President Washington asked for their opinions about a particular issue about which they disagreed. That issue was part of Hamilton's plan to correct the economic difficulties that had been haunting these states since the American Revolution. Remember, we talked about that the whole thing that led up to the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia was their inability to deal with various problems, and most of those problems were economic. So Hamilton came up with a program. Now, the main features of the program are listed on this slide, but the only one you really need to know about is the last one. He wanted to establish a Bank of the United States, a bank backed by the government of the United States that could make loans to people to help out with the economic recovery. The problem is as we previously discussed, the Constitution only gives certain enumerated powers to the central government. That word enumerated, what it literally means is numbered, but the way it's generally used is listed. So it gave us a list of what powers are given to this new government that was created, this government of the United States of America. And the question was, is one of those powers that the government can make a bank? Well, here's the list of powers that were actually enumerated for this new government to do. I won't go through in detail all these powers, but as you can look through here on your own time, pause the video if you want, what you will discover is there's nothing there about making a bank. So why did Alexander Hamilton think that the government could make a bank? Well, that list on the previous slide ends with this. It says that Congress will have powers to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Now, that language may be a little bit kind of hard to understand, but it's not a complicated idea. So on the previous slide, you saw this list of things the government could do, like that it could coin money, that it could create an army and a navy, that it could collect taxes, things like that. Well, those are the foregoing powers being talked about at the end here. Well, execution means actually doing those things. So it gives you the power to make a navy, for example. Well, how are you going to execute that? How are you actually going to make a navy? Well, among the things you'll need to do is you'll actually need to get ships for that navy. Well, does it actually say on the list you can get ships? No, it doesn't. But what this last passage in that list of enumerated powers says is that you can make all laws necessary and proper to carry out those foregoing powers. So, for example, it expressly says you can make a navy. Is it necessary and proper to get ships in order to have a navy? Yes. So you can go and get ships, even though it doesn't actually say you can get ships. So the question was, are there things there that the government is authorized that they can do, that it is necessary that we have a bank for? Well, Hamilton argued yes. And the way he argued it was by saying, well, necessary doesn't really mean necessary. Oftentimes it just means needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive. Basically saying, well, if it's kind of helpful, then we'll call it necessary. And I think a bank would be helpful for a bunch of these things, so let's do it. Thomas Jefferson said, no, that isn't what necessary means. Necessary does not mean convenient. What necessary means is that without this thing, the power that you're trying to use would be nugatory. In other words, it would be useless. So, for example, to go back to the example of the Navy, what necessary means is if we can't buy ships for our Navy, then what's the point of saying we have the power for a Navy? The power for having a Navy would be nugatory, because if you can't have ships, you can't have a Navy. Well, he looked at that and he said, you know, there's nothing on this list that you have to have a bank for. And that's what necessary means. Necessary means you have to have it. Not just that it's useful to have it, not just that it's convenient to have it, it's that you have to have it. Well, what happened was Hamilton won the argument. George Washington supported the creation of a Bank of the United States. Congress passed a law. We ended up with a Bank of the United States. And what happened was then that someone sued. You don't need to know all the details of the lawsuit, but it ended up with a case before the Supreme Court of the United States. That case is called MCCULLOCH versus Maryland. So what happened in this case then was that the Supreme Court had to decide who's right. Is Hamilton right that we actually can have a Bank of the United States? Or is Jefferson right that it's not actually necessary to have one? Well, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, agreed with Hamilton also and said what necessary really means is you can use whatever means you deem appropriate as long as they're not prohibited. Well, this interpretation of the necessary and proper clause greatly expanded the powers of the government of the United States of America. And think about why this would be. Why would this interpretation expand the powers of the United States of America? Well, now the government is no longer limited to the enumerated powers on that list in Article 1, Section A of the Constitution. They can now add anything to it that they consider to be useful for accomplishing the things on that list. This is just the kind of thing that the Anti-Federalists had been worried about. This is the very sort of reason why they thought they needed to have a Bill of Rights to protect them. Well, this expansion of power then led to what many people viewed as abuses of power by the national government. And an early example of this concerned a tax on whiskey. So, as settlers started moving over the Appalachian mountain range and settling in what had at one point been areas reserved under the Proclamation Line for Native Americans, they started raising crops. But they had a transportation issue. How do you get your crops to market over this mountain range? Well, they were often raising various grains, and the grains themselves are very bulky to ship and very expensive to ship over the mountains to sell to people on the East Coast. And so what the farmers quickly realized was, if we take these grains and we actually distill them and make alcohol out of them, alcohol is a lot more compact, it's a lot more cheaper to ship, and we can ship that over the mountains to sell. And so what happened was these agricultural farmers went from raising food crops to raising alcohol, essentially. Well, then what happened was the government, the national government of the United States of America, passed a tax on whiskey. And the farmers on the other side of the mountains felt like this was an attack upon them. So what they did was they rebelled. They refused to pay the tax on the whiskey. Any tax collectors that showed up to try to collect the tax, they would assault them, tar and feather them, imprison them. In some cases, they may have even murdered them. In response to this, George Washington got the Army of the United States together and marched into western Pennsylvania, the heart of this whiskey rebellion, and put it down. Now, this is a remarkable moment because this is the only time in American history that the President of the United States, who is officially the Commander-in-Chief of the military, actually rode into battle as the leader of the military. Now, it wasn't much of a battle. The Army showed up and quickly put down the Whiskey Rebellion, which showed just how much things had improved since the time of SHAYS Rebellion. But it shows the national government already flexing its power over the people and over the states. Another force in American society at this time that was potentially competing for power was religion, the churches. Historically, in the New World, in the colonies, many of the communities were founded as explicitly religious communities. You may remember the history of the founding of Massachusetts by people like the Pilgrims, who came there specifically for religious freedom. Now, ironically, what they oftentimes did when they got to America away from the oppression that they had experienced is they would then set up their own communities to be expressly religious in their way and not allow any other religions in their communities. They would say, okay, this community is going to be Puritan Christian, and if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. Well, that was a common theme among the colonies, that there were official religions for places. All of the states had official religions of one sort or another, whether it be a specific branch of Christianity or just Christianity in general, that they expected everybody in the state to practice, at least practice if they wanted to be part of the government. Well, this began to change during this time period as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in Virginia wrote a document called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was passed by the legislature there, which disestablished the church. Now, what this means is it broke the tie between government and a particular religion. No longer would there be an official religion that you had to practice to be part of the government in the state of Virginia. And this practice eventually spread to all the other states until by 1833, there were no longer established churches within the states. The other big area that this new government had to deal with was foreign relations. In other words, how the United States of America would conduct itself in regards to other countries. The American Revolution inspired rebels in other countries, particularly in Europe. A few years after the American Revolution in 1789, there was a revolution in France where the people there threw off rule by a king, which they had been under for hundreds of years. In the aftermath of that French Revolution, France ended up having to go to war with several countries in Europe. And there were a couple of reasons why. One was these other countries were worried about the people in France getting rid of their monarch and were worried that that might inspire people to do it in their own countries. The other reason was they saw France as weak in this moment, and they saw it as a chance to gobble up some of that power that France might otherwise have. Well, this series of wars, which lasted for a decade, involving France, involving Spain, involving Great Britain, and other countries, went on for 10 years. Well, during this time, the United States had some choices to make about who they would or would not support in these wars. And they had to make these choices because Europe was their primary trading partner. This is where they got goods from. This is where they sold materials. They had to have free access to trade in Europe. And it's kind of hard to do when these countries are all fighting each other out on the high seas, shooting at each other's ships. You don't want to get caught in the middle of that. So in 1793, George Washington issued a document called the Neutrality Proclamation, in which he said officially the United States is not taking sides in these conflicts. We're not on Great Britain's side, we're not on Spain's side, we're not on France's side, etc., etc. We are willing to do business with everybody. Well, despite his assertion of neutrality, there were people in Europe that wanted America to take sides. An example of this was this man, GENET. Now, he was called Citizen GENET because after the French Revolution, when they got rid of the king, they decided that they wouldn't have people with any titles above anybody else, so everybody called each other citizen. The thing ended up being a bloody, horrible mess eventually. They really didn't know how to take care of themselves, but along the way, they sent this man, Citizen GENET, to America to try to get America on the side of France in these ongoing conflicts. Now, from the point of view of France, this was completely reasonable. During the American Revolution, France had come to the aid of the United States. So now they expected the United States to come to their aid. But remember, the United States is just trying to survive, and we don't want to get in the middle of another war. So Citizen GENET is told, nope, the United States will not take sides here. But this doesn't stop him. What he does is he starts giving speeches to private citizens, trying to encourage them to go out as privateers, basically as pirates, to attack enemy ships, particularly privateers from the south of the United States, to go out and attack ships from Spain. Spain, remember, is down in the Caribbean, and they are trying to sail ships in the area near the United States coast, and Citizen GENET wants them to be attacked as a way to help France in these wars. Well, he is considered to then be out of line. A person from another country coming in and trying to influence the United States citizens, if not the United States government itself, to go to war with another country. He's told to leave, but by then his government back in France is falling apart. He's afraid if he gets home, he'll get his head chopped off, and so he refuses to go. Eventually, the whole thing just kind of peters out. But it was a scandalous event at the time. And it caused people to really start to take sides of whether or not they were supportive of France or Great Britain in these conflicts. This tendency for people to feel like they had to take sides was made even more obvious when Jay's Treaty was entered into in 1795. Jay's Treaty is named after John Jay, who was a justice on the United States Supreme Court at the time, who was sent to England to try to negotiate a treaty to enable better trade between the United States and Great Britain. The problem is when he successfully negotiated this treaty, it made some people feel like the United States was taking the side of Great Britain in this war with France. Now, this wasn't the case. The United States was officially neutral. They were willing to do business with anybody, and they were just formalizing a trade agreement with England. But again, this further exacerbated the problem of some people in the country feeling like we should be on France's side, some people feeling like we should be on England's side, and then becoming distrustful of each other as these things happen. This causes the people then in the country to break into two clear political camps that become known as the Federalists and the Republicans. Now remember, the Federalists are the same group who favored the ratification of the United States Constitution. In the first couple of elections in our country's history, they dominated the elections. George Washington was a Federalist. But as this dispute breaks out between groups of people that support England more and those who support France more, we have this division. The Federalists end up representing the elite people in the country, the people who want to make money off of doing business, and they see better opportunities to do business with England. If they have to choose sides, that's who they want to choose to be with. While the Republicans are more democratic in their nature. Now, I already talked previously about how none of the founding fathers were really democratic. They didn't really believe that the people should be in charge. But they thought that power should be more close to the people. It should be more local, more spread out among the population. They also thought that the needs of the common folk, the agrarian people, the farmers should be more important to the country than the merchants in the big city. And they felt for these reasons that they had more in common with France and the revolutionary government there that also had these sorts of ideals. So people fell into these two camps in the country. And these were the two camps that then contested the election of 1796. This was the first election that didn't involve George Washington running for president. Instead, his vice president, John Adams, ran for president, and Thomas Jefferson was the nominee of the Republicans to oppose him. Well, in the end, John Adams won a narrow election over Thomas Jefferson. Now, in an ironic twist, because of the election rules at the time, Thomas Jefferson became John Adams' vice president. This is how the Electoral College originally worked. When the votes were counted up, whoever got the most votes became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. These men were rivals who didn't really like each other, but they were forced to work together. Well, under John Adams, there ended up being a couple of scandalous things that happened. One of those was the XYZ affair. Now, the XYZ affair concerned the fact that France, having thought that America was taking England's side because of Jay's Treaty, had started attacking American ships out on the Atlantic Ocean. And John Adams wanted this to end, so he sent a representative to France to try to negotiate. Well, in France, he met 3 diplomats. They were called X, Y, and Z as code names for the correspondence that went back and forth between him and the government of the United States. And what was scandalous about this is they said, okay, yeah, we might be able to work something out for your government's benefit, but we want to be bribed first. Give us money. When he reported this back in America, it caused even more anti-French feelings among some people. Well, as the reaction of France to the treaty, Jay's treaty with England, caused them to believe that the United States was on England's side, what happened was, as I said on the previous slide, France started attacking American ships out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the United States, again, trying to remain neutral during this war between England, France, and Spain, does not officially declare war on France in response to this. Instead, it's the merchants themselves out on the ocean that have to arm their own ships with cannon and fight off the French who are attacking them. And this goes on for nearly 8 years of this this kind of fake war out in the ocean, with French ships occasionally attacking and fighting American merchant ships. So then we get to the election of 1800. John Adams is running for re-election, and Thomas Jefferson opposes him. But there are some things that happen before then that sway the balance of power. During this controversy of whether or not the United States should be on England's side or France's side, and France acting aggressively against the United States because of Jay's treaty, and there being a rising anti-French sentiment in the country, Congress passes a couple of laws to try to deal with this. One of these is the Alien Act, passed in 1798, which allows the government to deport, in other words, kick out of the country, any alien, in other words, somebody from another country, who they consider to be a threat against the United States of America. In particular, they're thinking about the French. Now, they never really enforce this law after it's been passed. What happens is most of the aliens, the people from other countries who are in the United States who feel they could potentially go to jail under this, just pack up and leave on their own. They self-deport. The other law that they pass is the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to criticize the President of the United States and other government officials. Now, this was passed because John Adams is a Federalist, and most of the people in Congress who passed the law are Federalists too. And they've grown tired of Republicans like Thomas Jefferson criticizing their president and criticizing their laws. So they pass a law to make such criticism illegal. This is a very controversial law. As it is debated and eventually voted on, fights break out in Congress over it. This then becomes the defining issue of the day as people go to vote in the election of 1800. It's the defining issue because some people argue that these Sedition Acts designed to protect the reputation of John Adams and other Federalists are clear violations of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In other words, Congress can't tell you what you can say or publish, even if it's something bad about them, or in this case, something bad about John Adams, President of the United States. So for the critics, the Sedition Act, well, they think the Alien Act is clearly unconstitutional, but it got passed by the Federalists anyway and got upheld by their courts, which were packed with Federalists. And so the Republicans begin to think that they're powerless, potentially, against a Federalist party that now controls everything in government and who can pass laws to even shut up their critics. So what happens is Thomas Jefferson and James Madison write a couple of documents proposing a way to potentially stand up against the Sedition Act. Thomas Jefferson's document is adopted as official resolution of the state of Kentucky, a new state in the Union. James Madison's document is adopted as an official resolution of Virginia. So these become known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So what are they proposing new? What is their new idea for dealing with the Sedition Act, even though the government is entirely controlled by Federalists in Washington, D.C.? What they propose is that if the government does something in violation of the Constitution, that every state should be able to nullify that law within their area of authority. In other words, for example, the state of Kentucky or the state of Virginia could say the Sedition Act does not apply in Kentucky. It does not apply in Virginia. We will criticize John Adams all we want. And if somebody tries to throw us in jail for criticizing John Adams, we'll throw that person in jail instead. This is an idea that lays the groundwork for what will eventually lead to the American Civil War. The American Civil War is really about this idea of nullification. This idea that is traceable back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the dispute over the Sedition Act. Well, in the election of 1800, we have a rematch between John Adams, the sitting president of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson, his vice president. And by this point, public opinion has swayed against John Adams and the Federalists. They lose badly. So John Adams ends up being a one-term president, and Thomas Jefferson ends up being elected president instead. The Republicans come and sweep to power in Congress also. Their opposition to the Sedition Act and their claims about it being unconstitutional are enough to sway the public in their favor. But it's actually not that easy. And the reason is because of the way the Electoral College still worked back then. The way the Electoral College was originally set up, each elector would actually have 2 votes. They would cast 1 vote each for 2 different people running for president. And then they would count up the votes, and whatever person got the most votes would be president. Whatever person got the second most votes would be vice president. Well, with most of the electors being chosen to be Republicans, they've all been assigned to cast 1 vote for Thomas Jefferson to be president and a second vote for Aaron Burr, another Republican, so that he'll become the vice president. But think about the fundamental mistake they made. If they all cast 1 vote for Jefferson and 1 vote for Aaron Burr, in the end, they end up having the same number of votes. And we actually have a tie for president. Rather than Jefferson getting the most votes and being president, and Aaron Burr getting the second most votes and becoming vice president, they are tied. Well, Electoral College ties are decided by the House of Representatives. I don't need to go into all the details of how this is done, but just know that eventually the House of Representatives had to vote on who they wanted to have as president, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr. And what swung the vote was Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson's old rival from the Bank of the United States, comes in and he tells his allies in the House of Representatives, essentially, Aaron Burr's a scoundrel. Don't dare vote for him. Yes, Thomas Jefferson is my enemy, but at least he's not a scoundrel. At least he's an upright, sort of decent human being. So if you have to vote for one or the other, don't vote for the bad guy, Aaron Burr. Vote for Thomas Jefferson. And that's enough to sway the vote in Thomas Jefferson's favor. He becomes president. Well, in response to that, and some other things that Aaron Burr thought were slights from Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel. Now, duels still existed back then, but they had become sort of formalized. They were done as a way to demonstrate that you were manly, not to really kill the other person. So what would happen is when somebody was challenged to a duel, they'd go off in the countryside, they would pace away from each other, they would turn around, and they would intentionally miss each other. And then once honor had been satisfied, then they'd have a big picnic and everybody would go home. Well, that isn't what happened. They turned around to face each other. Hamilton intentionally missed Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr shot Hamilton in the heart and killed him. This was legal to do. It wasn't considered the honorable thing to do, which caused even more people to hate Aaron Burr, but that was the death of Alexander Hamilton. Well, because of this screw-up in the election of 1800, an amendment was passed, the 12th Amendment, which changed the Electoral College system slightly. What it did was now when electors vote, they explicitly cast 1 ballot for president and 1 ballot for vice president. So no more ties by electors casting 2 votes for different people and every elector doing the same thing. This then leaves us with the last topic of this lesson, which concerns something that we kind of left out before, although you may not have noticed. Way earlier in the lesson, we talked about the three branches of government and how they were originally set up and what they were able to do. And I took a few moments talking about Congress making laws and about the president executing the laws, but I didn't really talk about the courts. And the reason for this is because the courts are not explicitly given their power in the Constitution. It was something they had to grab later on. And the opportunity came because of the election of 1800. After John Adams lost the election, he had several months while he was still president before Thomas Jefferson would take over. And during that time, he appointed a whole bunch of judges. They became collectively known as the Midnight Judges. And this was his way to ensure that the Federalist Party would at least still have power over the courts after they had to give up their power in the presidency and in Congress. Well, John Adams didn't personally hand out these appointments to the new judges. Instead, he handed them off to his Secretary of State, who was John Marshall. John Marshall, who would later become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court himself. So what happened was he handed them to John Marshall, but John Marshall himself, having been appointed to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, decided he was too busy to do anything with them, and he went over to the server on the Supreme Court, left the appointments literally sitting on his desk for these new judges, and then John Adams left office and Thomas Jefferson took over as President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson then appointed James Madison to be his Secretary of State. And when James Madison walked into his office, he found this pile of appointments on his desk. Letters giving people jobs as judges that had been issued by John Adams. And James Madison said, wait a minute, I'm a Republican. John Adams is a Federalist. I'm not going to deliver these appointments, and he threw them in the trash. Well, one of the men who was supposed to get an appointment was a guy named William Marbury, and he knew he was supposed to get the appointment, but he never got it. So he sued. And the case, Marbury versus Madison, demanding that Madison give him his appointment, went to the Supreme Court of the United States. But now remember, John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the guy who was supposed to deliver Marbury his appointment but didn't do it. Now, he's got to lead the court in deciding this case, but he's between kind of a rock and a hard place. People might think that he, as a fellow Federalist, would obviously agree with Marbury and say, yep, Marbury should get his appointment as a judge. But if he does that, he's going to make the Republicans mad at him. And the Republicans are already threatening ideas like impeaching him to get rid of him as Chief Justice. They're kicking around ideas like reducing the size of the Supreme Court and its influence, things like that. So he wants to maintain the power of the court, but he doesn't want to just screw Marbury over either. So he comes to a brilliant solution. What he decides to do, in his opinion, is say, Marbury, you should win this case. You do deserve the appointment, but we can't hear your case. The reason is because the law that was passed to make you think we could take your case and decide it was actually illegal. It was unconstitutional. And any law that is unconstitutional, we can declare to be void. In other words, invalid. So sorry, Marbury, you lose, because the law that made you think you could come to us is invalid. Now, this made the Republicans happy. Marbury had lost. He doesn't get his appointment. None of the other judges do either. But this decision was actually a big win for the Supreme Court. Well, how so? In the decision, the Supreme Court was able to declare a law unconstitutional. Now think about that. This is the supreme power that any part of government can have. To be able to tell the other parts of government what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do. This is like being a referee in a sporting event. The referee is actually the most powerful person on the field. And that is what the Supreme Court has just assumed to be. The referee that tells everybody else in government what they can and can't do. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says they can do this. They just did it in Marbury versus Madison, and they got away with it. And that is what has given the Supreme Court all its power that it's ever had since then. And that power to declare laws unconstitutional, we call judicial review. And that's it for Lesson 6 from American Yawp.